This is the Crime Cafe, your podcasting source of great crime, suspense, and thriller writing. I'm your host, Debbi Mack. Before I bring on my guest, I'll just remind you that the Crime Cafe has 2 ebooks for sale, the 9-book box set and the short story anthology. You can find the buy links for both on my website, debbimack.com, DEBBIMACK.com, under the Crime Cafe link. You can also get a free copy of either book if you become a Patreon supporter. You'll get that and much more if you support the podcast on Patreon, along with our eternal gratitude for doing so. Hi everyone. It's my great pleasure to have with me today one of the most eclectic writers doing crime fiction, among other things. An author in multiple genres, including mystery, westerns, horror, science fiction, and suspense. He has also written for comics. Several of his novels have been adapted for film and TV. My guest is none other than the very awesome Joe Lansdale. Hi, Joe. I'm so excited to talk with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, it's so great to have you on. I first got to know your work as a reviewer for Mystery Scene magazine, actually.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, that's way back, yeah.
Yeah, it's great. It was wonderful. I got these wonderful free books, and I got to read them and talk about them. It was great. So my Lansdale starter book was Edge of Dark Water, and boy, did that make an impression on me.
I'm glad it did.
Tell me, when you wrote it, did you think of it as a young adult novel? Because it's a very mature young adult novel, and I love that about it.
No, I didn't really think of it as a young adult novel. It was the first novel I did for my new publisher, Mulholland, which is a branch of Little Brown. And it was just the story I wanted to tell. And I've always liked stories with young people as protagonists. In fact, I've written quite a few with young people as protagonists. And so it just seemed natural to me. And, it just rolled out.
Mm-hmm. I know that feeling, actually, the feeling of something just rolling out.
It's good for you.
Yes, it is. I have this one young adult novel I've done, and it's kind of like this real, kind of variation from what I usually do. So, but the fact that you write in multiple genres, to me, is so encouraging. But let me get to the latest thing that you have out, which is in the anthology, A Time for Violence. Am I correct about that?
Yes, there is an anthology that has my story in it, too, among others. Yeah.
I got to tell you, I loved that story. It was like the world's most twisted holiday story.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's the highest compliment I can think to make for that particular story. It's awesome. One thing I enjoy about your writing is the way you combine serious social issues with humor. Can you talk a bit about Hap and Leonard and where those characters came from?
Well, Hap and Leonard really were an accident. I had a 2-book contract for Bantam, which I was very excited about, for 2 crime novels. And the first one I wrote was Cold in July. And when I finished Cold in July, I thought, I'd like to write another novel that kind of has that old gold medal novel feel, which the Fawcett Gold Medal was a branch that did crime, and then there was another branch of it that did westerns and and so on, science fiction. And I'd collected those gold medal novels for years, and I liked the way they told stories, and I liked the attitude. So I wanted to capture something with something of that tone. And I had always thought that I would like to write something about the era that I grew up in, that I became an adult in, which was the 60s, early 70s, and about civil rights and the Vietnam War and the kind of contradiction of people and ideas of that era. And so I don't think I was conscious of it when I started writing the novel. But I said, I'm going to use my own background to a great extent in this book. Now, Hap is not me, but he's damn close. And he went to prison for being against the Vietnam War, and I dropped out of school to be drafted to kind of protest the Vietnam War, so therefore I was drafted. I said I wouldn't go. I thought I was going to prison for 18 months, but I ended up, they gave me a 1Y for whatever reason. I think they threw me a bone, actually, and sent me home. But I used that as kind of the basis for HAP, and the fact that his experiences in the 60s, and the feeling that in the 80s, a lot of that idealism had gone the way of the passenger pigeon. And I wanted to sort of bring that back up and try to have HAP experience that again and be touched by it. But I also wanted to show that there were a lot of divisions and sides of it, and the fact that really young people had sort of led that quote, revolution, unquote, because it was really a varied group of different ideas. But because they had and they were young, they didn't really have a realistic view of what was going on. That doesn't mean the idealism was wrong, but it meant the expectations were a little bit dramatic. And so I had this in the background, and I had this sort of story I wanted to tell that took place where I grew up and took place around the kind of people I grew up with and the kind of people that we were in the 60s and early 70s, or a lot of us were. And so I just started writing from that standpoint, and Hap was the only character. I didn't plan for there to be a buddy book at all, and I had Leonard in it as just kind of a side character, but all of a sudden Leonard starts really becoming prominent as I'm writing it, and I had this white, liberal, heterosexual whose best friend was a black, gay Republican who had been to Vietnam and had different viewpoints than Hap had. And as I wrote it, I realized this was really good because it gave you a chance to kind of explore both sides and both kinds of people, and without, making it a lecture. And I just found I really, really liked these two characters, and I felt so close to Hap because of the connections with my own life, and I felt close to Leonard because he was made up of a variety of different people I had known in my life. And so I felt like when I talked to him, I was partly talking to a flip side of myself in some ways, and yet also this combination of characters that I had melted together to make Leonard. And then I brought in Hap's ex-wife, and I did have an ex-wife, but I want to rush to say that was not my ex-wife. And so this was all kind of in there, but I had been through the whole, early divorce as a young man, and during this 60s or early 70s, and the disappointment that a lot of us had in how we thought we were going to change the world. And we were naive, which doesn't mean that the intent is naive, but it means our expectations of how it would be done and how easily it might be accomplished were. So that was all in the novel, more to me than the storyline. And I put people that conflicted with what Leonard believed and what Hap believed because they were more extremists, but yet there was this connection that he had with these people in a funny way, and with his ex-wife, who was an extreme idealist, and who was also somebody who abandoned men easily because she always wanted a new, fresh idea. She was in love with being in love more than anything else. Yet she was at the heart and at the bottom of it the most idealistic of all of them, and the most sincere about her idealism, I think. And so maybe there's a character, Chubb, that might have been equally so. But I just sort of let that story unravel, and then when I got through with it, I thought I had left Hap and Leonard alone, and I tried to write another book for a new publisher I was with. I moved from Bantam to Warner Mysterious Press, and I wrote an entire book, and I wasn't happy with it, and the publisher was like a little not sure what to do with it because it was really dark. And I said, you know what, let me go home and think. So I went home. By the time we flew home from New York, where we had been visiting with our editor at that time, my wife was with me, we got home, and immediately Hap started speaking to me, and I realized he'd been trying to speak to me for a while, and I wasn't listening because I thought I was through with that book. I thought I was through with that character. And as this character spoke to me, I sat down, and in about 3.5, 4 months, I wrote a brand new novel, and I wrote it in a much more relaxed style, like Savage Season had been. But I think by that point, for Mucho Mojo, which is the second in the series, which many people thought was the first because the Bantam edition had gone out of print at that time. I think I began to realize how deep their relationship was, Hap and Leonard's, and I began to realize how traumatic their experiences in life had affected them. They were dealing with post-traumatic stress in ways of a different sort. Leonard's would have been from Vietnam, of course, which would have been a much more dramatic sort. But, Hap had been to prison. He had been disappointed in what he thought the world could be. And so they were both dealing with these things which in some ways changed them and made them different people. And when they were together, they made a third entity that was both of them. And so by that point, I was caught up who the characters were. And I hope that wasn't too long, but I was trying to answer your question in full,
yeah,
about who they were.
Answer. That's a great answer. Thank you. That's so true. All about that, about the 60s and the youthful stuff, and personifying those issues within real people,
Yes.
in people in the novel interacting.
Well, the thing that I didn't know when I was young was that how many people were just on board with it because it was the fad of the time for them. I mean, long hair, beads,
exactly.
Being anti-establishment, and then as soon as it was time to, they got a little older, as soon as it was time to hit up against the wall, they bailed, and I realized that it was just easier because to be the person that stands up against the war or to be the person that stands up for civil rights, it has consequences. And, and so, I suffered some of those consequences. For me, it wasn't particularly important because what I was trying to do was more important, though certainly a lot of people did more than I ever did. But I begin to have that feeling of faded ideal, wounded optimism is, I guess, what you would say, because I begin to realize that most people don't believe anything very deeply. If they're, character is what you have when, you're under stress, when you're under a bad situation and you maintain that character. But if you just blow with the wind, it's not character, nor is it a really dedicated belief. And I don't want to overstate all this too much, but what I'm trying to do is give a background to how I saw these characters and how they were rooted in my own life. And so that when I wrote about them, and some books vary, some books are more just entertainment, excitement, and some are, they're all supposed to be entertainment, but some are purely that more, and the best ones, I believe, have much more information about social issues and political issues, and they don't always come down with an exact stance, because life is just full of little disappointments, and I try to put those in the stories and yet make them something that people want to pick up and read no matter what their convictions are.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny because I'm not far behind you in terms of age. I'm old enough to remember the hippies, but too young to have been a part of them. So that feeling of disappointment in the potential there is something that I eventually felt in the 70s. It was like, hey, where did you guys go?
Well, the funny thing is that when people talk about the 60s, they're also really talking about the early 70s. Yeah. Because, there's no exact time when this started. I mean, you can date it back to the 50s and further when people are further back when people were interested in trying to correct racial situations or protesting the war. Early on, there were people that said, hey, this is probably not a good idea. But it was just from about the middle 60s when music began to be welded more to social issues. You started seeing that become more important. And music was kind of like the soundtrack of our lives at that time. And I guess that's true of every generation. But this was, the Beatles and people like that had a lot of social agenda in their music as well as just, very well written tunes. And that all went on over into the 70s. And when the Vietnam War ended and that threat of the draft ended for a lot of people, so did their idealism because they were no longer in trouble. I have friends that were opposed to the Vietnam War that are Trump voters, and they were for civil rights. And, I don't know where they're coming from. I don't know how they went that way. I mean, they get to choose who they want to vote for, but it's different too than knowing people that were always like that, and then knowing people who weren't like that who switched. I mean, and of course, I also have people I've known who were conservatives who've gone the other way. But it's just amazing to understand how transient people's views are if they're not really, truly dedicated to those views, or how easily they can be changed if it just makes it easier to get along in society sometimes. Because it's hard sometimes to be an outsider. Like, in my case, it's really not that hard because I've always been sort of independent. I worked for other people. I never really cared what they thought, but I've always gotten along with a wide variety of people, a wide variety of interests. I'm politically different than a lot of the people here. Not all. There's a lot more of us in the moderate to liberal camp than you would expect. But I'm also an atheist in a very religious society. And so, those things, I think, can wear the edge off a lot of people, and they eventually just go with the flow. And I didn't want to do that, and I didn't want to have characters, at least in those Hap and Leonard books, which we're talking about now, that did that.
That's so cool. Let's see. I happened to catch your interview on the Prolific Writer podcast, where you mentioned that you read pretty much all the time. I'm like that,
yes,
too. Talk about the importance of reading, please.
Well, I think that most people that write begin being a writer or want to be a writer because they love to read. And a lot of times what happens to some of those writers is that the more they write, the less they read because it's so demanding and can wear you down. But a lot of times the real reason that people cease to read is they fail to have the exact same experience that thrilled them in the first place, and they don't realize that there are so many new and different kinds of experiences that you can have out there. Some writers continue to give you that experience no matter what over a lifetime of work. But I can say that my sentimental favorite writer, for example, of all time, is Edgar Rice Burroughs. Now, a lot of his things have dated, social issues, stuff like that, but it makes no difference. This was the writer I'd already wanted to write, but this is a writer that when I read him, I knew I had to write. And so that writer gave me an impetus to get excited about books. Well, then I branched out and read other books. And when you start reading books and you find that it's the same familiar story over and over, sometimes you lose interest. So to be a writer and to be a dedicated reader, which gives you about as much great satisfaction as anything, you also have to be willing to get outside your comfort zone. And I used to read almost a book a day at certain times in my life when I had that time and also ability. I could also read a little faster than I can now, although I'm by most standards a fast reader. But I still read 3 and 4 novels a week, or books a week, not always novels, sometimes nonfiction, collections of short stories, what have you. But that's about my average, and when I don't do that, it's usually because I'm spending the time cramming on a series of TV shows or movies, or I'm listening to radio shows. I do martial arts a lot. I've been doing that all my life, 56 years. I'm older now, but I still keep my hand in that by teaching. And so you can have a bigger life than just reading books. And if you're working a full-time job, you might not be able to read 3 or 4 a week. But you know what? You probably can read 1, and you probably could certainly read a couple, 3 a month. And if you want to write, that's what gives you the fuel, and that's what gives you the ambition, because you may not necessarily be competing against other writers, though some people do that, but you can be inspired by other writers. And so many writers gave me an understanding of how to do better prose. And you start out when you're really young, you're kind of copying these other writers, but pretty soon you start to, if you're doing it right, you start to abandon that and find your own voice, but you're still straining through cheesecloth all of these other writers that you've read. And, in my case, it'd be like Robert Bloch, or Richard Matheson, Ray Bradbury, Charles Beaumont, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Carson McCullers, Harper Lee, all of these writers. And even now, I discovered Ellen Gilchrist about 2 years ago. And, of course, she's been around a long time and has a stack of work. But except for a couple of short stories, I hadn't read her. Well, now I'm excited about her work. And so that's constantly giving me fuel to do a better job with what I do, even if what I'm doing is nowhere similar to what they've done or are doing.
Yes. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, reading widely and reading all the time is exactly that. Fuel.
Yeah.
And
you have time to do it. You know, when I worked full-time jobs, you know, sometimes 8 and 10 hours a day, maybe I had to maybe read a little less per week, but I read every day. I made sure that I did that. I wrote every day. And I'm sure there are people that say, well, I just can't do that. And if you can't, then I leave that to you to make that decision. But a lot of people who think they can't just won't. They might find time to watch 4 hours of TV or spend time to go out and get a case of beer and sit and bullshit with their buddies, but they can't find 30 minutes to an hour a day to write, or they can't find 30 minutes to an hour a day to read. It's hard for me to have a whole lot of sympathy for people who claim they want to write or claim they would like to have time to read, and they won't take that time. Now, I've got to the point now in my life, I'm busy all the time, but I always have heard this old saying that I think is true. If you want something done, ask a busy person, because they know how to get it done. That doesn't mean they're always going to do it or be able to do it, but they're more likely to do it if it interests them. And that's because they've learned to manage their time. I manage my time, but it's not like I make a list. I don't have that kind of mindset. I couldn't follow that kind of program. But every day I get my writing done. I read every day. I usually spend a little time watching television or movies. I try to exercise every day. You know, I try to teach martial arts private classes at least once a week, and I'm going to do that until I get too old to do it. My wife and we travel a lot. I take my laptop with me, and sometimes I'll work 15 minutes while she's in the shower. When we're on a trip. And then later in the evening, I might work another hour, or I might work another 15 minutes. But when I get through and come home, I may not have been able to write as regularly or at the same regular times as I normally do. But I'm often surprised to find out how much time I do write. I was just on a book tour, and it was one of those things where you get up at the crack of dawn and you get on the plane, or you go to the airport, you get on the plane, you fly to where you're going. By the time you get there, it's time to go there. Then when you go there, it's over with, but it's time to go back to the hotel, go to bed early so you can get up the next morning. And I still found time to write most of those days, even if it was just like for 15 or 20 minutes before bed, or midday. Occasionally I'd be back at the hotel while I was waiting for a secondary event. But I did that. I wrote an entire story and a half over that 3 weeks, which is a little less than I might do if I were home. But you know what? It was done, and I felt better. If I had not written it all, if I had not tried to write it all, I would have been miserable. And so that keeps the juices flowing, and so that when I don't have those periods where I stop and you feel like you're starting completely over. When I finish a book or a story, I rarely take time off, or I take 1 or 2 days, or a case a week, and then I'm back at it again, because writing is one of those things that the tools get dull very, very quickly. So you have to keep them sharp, and that's how you do it, or at least that's how I do it.
So true. For me, it's keeping a journal, you know?
Yeah, some people do. I know several people that do. I never could keep one. I can't. By the time I sit down to write a journal, I just write.
Well, it's funny the way my journal has a tendency to go back and forth between ideas for stories and
yeah,
my
I can understand that totally. Yeah. And you know, my belief too is when I talk about what I do, my belief is simple: is that my way is not the only way. It's just, for me, it's the best way. And I arrived at my way though by a trial and error, especially for the first 7-8 years. But I also arrived that way by paying attention to how other people work and what worked for them. And so I would borrow a little piece from this and a little piece from that, and sometimes I would discard this and I would retain this. And then over a period of time, I found what worked for me. And it's basically, I write in the mornings. I write about 3 hours, and then I usually don't write anymore that day. I have 3 hours. I got the rest of the day to do other stuff, which sometimes deals with business. You know, you have other aspects of your business if you're a full-time writer other than the writing itself. But that's the main thing. I get up, 3 hours, I'm done. Rarely do I go back. So every once in a while I'll go back in the afternoon, maybe work on something that's really, driving me, or sometimes at night. I've awakened in the middle of the night and gone up and wrote. But 9 times out of 10, the way I work is I get up in the morning, I write roughly 3 hours. I have a rule. I have to do 3 to 5 pages a day. And it's rare that I miss that. And most of the time, I get more than that. I might get 6. I might get 8. And in some rare cases, I've gotten far more than that. Mm-hmm. So I correct as I go, and then I do one little polish when I get done, so that within an average of, it can be 3 to 6 months, I usually have a book, because I showed up every day, and I had those days when I got more than 3 to 5, and I polished as I went. And I've been doing it now for 46 years, and full time for right at just under 40. So, you tend to give it regular exercise when it's tied to a passion, and it's also tied to the way you pay your bills. That also helps.
Yep. When it comes down to it, you got to pay the bills.
Well, you do, and the idea that I hear some people, I'm just an artist and all that, and my thing is, go to hell. I try to be an artist too, but Hemingway cashed his checks. F. Scott Fitzgerald cashed his checks. So did Faulkner. All of those writers were adamant about being paid and wanted to be paid. And most of the time, when you hear people say that, they're people who just really are not putting much effort into it, or they're not being very successful at it. I'm not saying that's an absolute by any means, but I'm saying a professional writer writes. I'm not one of these people that just writes as a hobby. I do it because I love it. When I was very young, I wanted to be a professional writer. When I discovered pencils, I wanted to write. And I remember hearing that Beatles song, Paperback Writer, and I thought, yeah, that's what I want to be, I want to be a paperback writer. Well, we don't have much in the way of paperbacks like they did then, but I understood that song really struck me, and I've always thought that I'm one of the luckiest people in the world. I was born relatively poor, not destitute. My parents were good parents, but my father couldn't read or write. My mother, she had what was then a high school education, which was 11th grade. And, they were poor all their life and worked hard. And I worked in the rose fields. I worked aluminum chair factories. I did janitor work for years. I did all kinds of odd and in jobs for years, partly because, and I had some college. I got about 60 hours over 4 years, I think. But the thing is I knew that writing was what I wanted to do. It was what I would do best, and it was what I was geared naturally toward. So I just kept working until I could sell, and then I worked from there to when I can make a living. And then I discovered almost by accident that perhaps I had a little more ability and talent than I expected. And maybe I could, do something a little unusual. I didn't set out to do a specific thing. I just wanted to do as well as I could, and I was fortunate. It worked out for me.
Well, that is so wonderful, and it is to our good fortune that it has worked out for you, too.
Well, thank you.
And I could talk to you for 3 hours or for forever, but is there anything else that you'd like to add before we finish?
No, not really. I mean, I would just say that I've got the Elephant of Surprise, which is my new Hap and Leonard book that's out. For those of you, that small group that are Ned the Seal fans, the last of the trilogy called The Sky Done Ripped comes out this fall. Next year is a non-Hap and Leonard novel called More Better Deals. It's a crime novel. And Jane Goes North, which is about 2 women on a road trip. And I think it's, my favorite of all the things I've recently written. So
oh my gosh.
That's what I got. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I have to look for these books. Oh. Well,
I have a couple of short story collections too, so a lot of stuff.
Oh, very cool. Well, thanks again so much for talking to us today, Joe.
Of course, I enjoyed it.
Oh, this is wonderful. I've had a wonderful time, and I hope everybody out there listening is also appreciating this. This is just fabulous stuff.
Well, thank you for having me here. And like I always tell people, it may not be the best opinion, but it's the only one I got when I'm talking about writing and stuff.
Well, that's cool. And for those listening, look for A Time for Violence and other works by the wonderful Joe Lansdale. Watch Hap and Leonard.
Yes, on Netflix.
On Netflix.
Also, you can find Cold in July on Netflix, which is based on my novel, Cold in July. Stars Michael C. Hall, Sam Shepard, and Don Johnson, and it's a corker.
Very
They
good.
did a really good job, yeah. Bubba Hotep's been on MGM off and on, may still be. And so a lot of that. And Love, Death, and Robots actually has 2 of my stories.
Cool. Well, that's wonderful. This is the final episode of Season 4, but we'll be back in a few months. In the meantime, check out our back episodes, and there are 4 years of them, so there's plenty to choose from. They're on my website at debbimack.com, DEBBIMACK.com. And I'll be posting content for podcast supporters on my Patreon page in the interim, so I won't leave you completely high and dry, guys. In any case, thanks for listening, and until next time, happy reading.